Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for What's in Our Nation's Wallet, How Food Policy Councils Can Make Sense of a Federal Budget. We are delighted to have our very own Robert Martin, Director of the Food Systems Policy Program at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, here with us to talk about the federal budget process. Bob Martin is a political junkie and our federal watchdog. Bob leads the Center's federal policy strategy with the aim of advancing policies that protect the public's health and the environment by supporting a healthy, equitable, and sustainable food system. Before joining the Center for a Livable Future, Bob worked on and off of the Hill for over 30 years. His last gig on the Hill was working for a senator who served on the Senate Budget Committee and led an Appropriations Committee. While Bob served under a cardinal, his loyalty is still to the Orioles. So I don't know if you like baseball.
It was really the Royals.
The Royals, okay. Had to get it in there.
Yeah.
We know that the federal budget process is not a sexy topic, but it is important to the continuation of the nutrition and community food systems programs that we value. We're going to try to keep you engaged throughout the event today, so stay tuned for a few interactive polls and make sure to submit questions, as we will have time to talk with Bob after the presentation. Before I turn it over to Bob, I want to tell you a little about the software we are using and about the Center for a Livable Future. My name is Karen Bassarab, and I'm a Senior Program Officer with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future and the Food Policy Networks Project. I will be your moderator today. The platform we are using is called Zoom. It's a video conferencing and webinar system. All attendees are muted and will remain in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. At any point during the conversation, we invite you to submit your questions or comments through the Q&A or chat boxes. You can open the Q&A or chat boxes on the floating toolbar, which also contains buttons to adjust your audio settings and to raise or lower your hand. Finally, we will be recording the webinar today and we'll send out a link afterwards. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Center for a Livable Future is an interdisciplinary center located at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Our work focuses on the intersection of diet, environment, food production, and public health. Our education program includes a food systems certificate, food systems coursework, curriculum development, and supportive doctoral fellowships. We also conduct research, support other faculty members' research, and collaborate with other research institutions. We have 4 program areas. The Food Policy Networks Project is one of our projects. The goal of the Food Policy Networks Project is to build the capacity of food system stakeholders to reform local, state, regional, and tribal food systems through effective public policy. We do this through training, sharing best practices, networking with other food policy groups and leaders, and developing and providing food policy resources. I encourage you to check out our website at foodpolicynetworks.org. There you can sign up for our listserv to hear about future webinars. Today's conversation is part of a new ongoing initiative of the Food Policy Networks Project to offer food policy councils and peer organizations wishing to influence federal food and farm policy a place to learn about federal policy and connect with national advocates and policymakers. Through this initiative, we hope to build our understanding of the federal policymaking process, grow our capacity to advocate for policy across all levels of government, share our local experiences with national decision makers to inform federal policy, coordinate support for federal action, and connect local groups to national advocates and policymakers. With that, we're going to kick it off with a brief poll. Our first question is, how much do you know about the federal budget process? You could write a textbook about it. You know more than the average bear. You know what budget means. Or you don't know anything and you're a blank slate. Give people a few more seconds to respond. All right. Anyone else? Okay. So it looks like we kind of fall in the middle of that. Some know a little bit more than the average bear, but most kind of are in this to learn more about the budget process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, and he's going to help us to understand the federal budget process.
Thanks a lot, Karen. I really appreciate being asked to do the webinar this morning, and thanks to Ann Palmer, who leads the program. I actually participated in one other webinar with Kate Fitzgerald and Ferd Hofner on think how to influence the Farm Bill process. And I really enjoyed that experience. It's a little more, that topic's a little more interesting, I think, than the federal budget process, but certainly the budget and appropriations process, which is really linked and one leads to the other, are very, very important for the work we do. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to define a few terms, and I won't probably use all these terms in this webinar, but it's to help you understand as you're reading about it in the media or from other sources, because right now is a critical time in the federal budget process. We're very nearly approaching the end of the fiscal year, and you've probably been following all the talk about how the Republicans are scrambling one last time to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act before in the budget reconciliation process before the end of the fiscal year. So there's two basic types of legislation. There's authorizing legislation, which gives the government the legal authority to fund its operations. And authorizations can be on an annual basis or a multi-year basis or a permanent basis. A very good example of a multi-year authorization is the federal farm bill. It's authorized, well, over history it's depended, sometimes 4 years, but primarily a 5-year authorization. Appropriations then are the legislative activities that fund those programs, and they tend to be annual appropriations. A few more definitions, and I know there's a lot of words on the screen, and this is probably not the best way to explain things, but the overall governing legislation is the Budget Control Act of 2011. It's about this time in the history of the House and Senate that there was ongoing disputes of some intensity about trying to get a federal budget and the appropriations done every year. And as kind of a compromise, both Republicans and Democrats agreed to raise the debt ceiling, but place caps on discretionary spending for 10 years. So we're about 2/3 of the way through that. And also set deficit reduction targets that would be, if a budget wasn't in place, would be determined by a super committee, or would be, if the super committee could not come to agreement, they would be enacted by a process called sequestration or automatic spending cuts. And those cuts would fall equally percentage-wise, 50% from domestic spending and 50% from military spending. The Budget Control Act of 2011 amended the modern-day Budget Control Act of 1921 that had operated up until that time to govern this process. The budget resolution is part of the budget process. It's a non-binding resolution that's passed by both houses to really set spending guidelines and spending targets for all the budget discussions that will and decisions that will follow that. The reconciliation rule that I mentioned just a minute ago is part of that, and that is a process that is in place to permit both chambers to bring closure to the budget process, which is supposed to set these broader guidelines. And in a minute, when we talk about timeline, you'll see kind of how out of whack everything is. The budget authority is the federal government's ability to spend a given amount of money based on the approval from Congress. The government cannot spend money unless there is an appropriation, and the budget process leads to that. That's set out in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. So the process is critical for the federal government to perform some of its main functions. The chairman's mark or chair's mark is the first legislation introduced by the chairman of a subcommittee or a committee. You'll hear a lot of times now groups that are working to present policy concepts, non-governmental organizations or advocacy groups working with friendly members of Congress. They'll say they're working on a marker bill. So that's really kind of a placeholder bill that the chairman can use to be part of his or her mark or first piece of legislation. And we'll talk in a minute or two about the actual approval process. Fiscal year is pretty obvious. It's the amount of time covered by the specific budget. The federal fiscal year is October 1st to September 30th. A continuing resolution is a bit of a safety valve or escape hatch when Congress can't seem to do its job and pass budgets on time. They do something called a continuing resolution that primarily extends funding for a specified amount of time in the resolution at current spending levels. There are sometimes modest adjustments within a continuing resolution, but for the most part, it's extending current spending into the future. There was this was apparent recently in the news when, if you recall, the Republican leadership of the Congress was advocating for an extension of 18 months, continuing resolution of 18 months to get them past the next election. And that ever unpredictable president of ours, President Trump, cut a deal with the Democrats to temporarily raise the debt ceiling and a short-term extension of the current fiscal spending pattern until December of this year. So it's about a 2-month extension with the promise that he would work with them on the Dreamers Act, reforming the Dreamers Act. So it was a bit of it was as dramatic a thing as you can do in budget policy. I thought we would be right now facing this critical point of the government shutdown or not, but that safety valve, that continuing resolution for about 3 months changed that. Past continuing resolutions have been for a month, or I think the one right before this year was actually another 18-month resolution. It's really a way for them to not do their job. An omnibus bill is if the 12 appropriations bills required for operation of the government are not approved, then they can be bundled into one massive bill and approved all at once. There's sometimes a derivative of this called the minibus. I didn't put that on here, but that's usually a smaller number of appropriations bills lumped together. So there's two basic types of spending. Mandatory spending is really spending that the government has to do based on current law. And it's usually programs that have criteria for spending that aren't really subject to congressional maneuvering unless those criteria are changed. Social Security is a good example. That's a formula that's in law. The government has to fund the formula unless they change the formula, so that's mandatory spending. Medicare, Medicaid, some veterans medical programs are that way as well. And SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, is an example of that too, that you have to spend X amount of money based on the criteria for being accepted into the program. I think of those mandatory programs I've listed, the only one that comes under regular assault is SNAP. They seem to be willing to change the criteria for SNAP beneficiaries annually, which is disconcerting because they're given that leeway. Even though SNAP is part of the Farm Bill, they're really given that leeway. Discretionary spending is basically everything else, and that is really more of the focus of the budget and appropriations process. This chart shows total spending, I think, for fiscal year 2015, and I've got some charts coming up that unfortunately will be a little bit hard to read, but shows you the differences between mandatory, discretionary, and total spending. So if you look, and it's important when people are talking about, well, we spend X amount of the budget on Y, really what they're referring to. Are they talking about the percentage of discretionary spending? Are they talking about the percentage of mandatory spending, or of the spendings combined? So the upper left-hand chart shows what President Obama proposed for discretionary spending. That spending they had latitude to control in his budget that year. And you'll see military has a 55% component of that, or takes up 55% of the discretionary spending. That's the big blue chunk. But if you look at the mandatory spending, there's really nothing in there at all for military. But if you look at the combined spending, military funding dropped from 55% to 16.2% of total spending. So it's very important to know, if you want to geek people out, which type of spending you're talking about. Another one to look at, I think, is health spending. That if you look at discretionary spending versus total spending, mandatory spending versus total spending, you'll see that it drops, spending for healthcare drops from 38% of the budget down to about 28% of the budget. This next slide's a lot of fun. This is the headache slide. We can look at the budget process and appropriations process in 4 basic phases. The first phase is the agency planning, and most federal agencies have an ongoing planning component. They have budget people that are tracking current fiscal year spending and planning for future years as much as 18 months before the start of the fiscal year. Sometimes they even go as far as 5-year projections into the future, usually doing an ABC level budget. So A level budget would be their dream budget. B is basic, no changes in programs and spending. C level budget is if there's a catastrophe and they have to gut spending. And they do a pretty good job, I think. So phase 2 is really a review of the agency's proposals by the Office of Management and Budget. They are heavily involved in working with the agencies to develop their budgets. They're also a bit draconian in their ability to influence rules and regulations that are promulgated by the different agencies of the government. One good example was when FDA was working on issuing their guidances, their voluntary guidances on antibiotic use. OMB held it up for 18 months, even though the experts at FDA had submitted it and said, here's what we want to do. OMB really kind of slowed the process down. That's not budget, but that shows the power of OMB. So phases 1 and 2 really take place before this chart, because phase 3, the way I look at it, is the Congressional Appropriations cycle, which we'll go through in a little bit more detail, not as much detail as this chart, because I've never met anybody that didn't get a headache from looking at that. So that is the start of the Congressional Appropriations process or cycle. Phase 4, in my mind, of the budget process is when the budget's done and it goes back to the agencies for implementation. So as I said, it's really an ongoing process in the executive branch. A good illustrative example is the fiscal year that starts October 1 of this year. So that would be, well, no, actually, let me say that we're almost done with the fiscal year that began October 1 of, well, no, I've confused myself. Well, we'll just stick with the slide. The planning for that began actually about 18 months before the fiscal year, which it's trying to influence. The OMB has very strong oversight. For example, from October 18 months out until September, you know, a little over a year or a little under a year. And then the intensive review is about a 3-month period by OMB. And all this time, the agencies are having to defend what they've proposed to OMB for spending. The president's budget is supposed to be presented to Congress. I should go back and say, too, agencies and the OMB rely on the Office of Science and Technology of the President, OSTP, for input on the budget, which it seems kind of weird because it's another broad-ranging executive agency. It's not as powerful as OMB, but it does have quite a bit of influence. So the president's budget is supposed to be presented on the first Monday of February. So it'd be February 2016 for fiscal year 2017. And that's, again, required by that original budget law. One of the things that has always struck me about budget and appropriations work is deadlines really don't mean all that much. So even though they're required to submit it by the first Monday of February, they can get an extension or exemption from Congress by, it particularly happens when a new president's being inaugurated. Wouldn't be realistic for a president coming in January 20th to submit his own budget by February 3rd or so. And in fact, a lot of times, if it's, you know, a president that came to office not in such a hostile environment as now, they a lot of times will adopt their predecessor's budget. And from the time the election happens until the budget needs to be submitted, the incoming administration will work with the outgoing administration on budget issues. In this case, with transition between Obama and Trump, that was really not the case. It was a pretty hostile transition. So if you move from the budget process to the congressional process, it's a little bit more focused. The budget resolution and congressional appropriations follow the same basic legislative process. As I said, the president's budget's received in February. The first order of business by the budget committees is to pass this budget resolution in each chamber, setting those spending guidelines. They're supposed to do it by April 15th. But they're still working on the budget resolution now because that's how the vehicle they're going to use to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act one last time. And once the budget resolution establishes those spending levels, the Appropriations Committee makes what's called 3012B allocations to the Appropriations Subcommittee chairs. And to show you the power of the Appropriations Committee, those subcommittee chairs are sometimes referred to as cardinals, which is a very powerful level in the Catholic Church. So here's a list of the appropriations bills that need to be passed each year. The top photo, I'm trying to add something other than lots of words. It's the empty Senate Appropriations Committee room. It's in the U.S. Capitol. It's one of the few committee rooms actually in the U.S. Capitol. And you can see how really small it is. Behind each of the chairs on each side, there's about 3 feet. And the bottom picture shows the Appropriations Committee actually meeting. So those are the 12 bills that have to be passed, funding most of the, or all of the government. In my experience, the first passed tend to be the Defense Authorization Bill and Defense Appropriations Bill, followed closely by Military Construction and Veterans Affairs. Legislative branch tends to be the last because they're all very modest about funding their own branch of government. Agriculture tends to fall somewhere in between as far as legislative priorities. So here's the basic process. Each bill has to be approved by the subcommittee. Then the full Appropriations Committee needs to approve it. Once it is passed by the full committee of the respective house, it has to be passed by that full chamber. On the Senate side, there are 31 members of the Appropriations Committee. Committee's composition reflects the percentage of seats that party has in the chamber. Since the Senate is very narrowly divided, there are 16 Republicans and 15 Democrats on the Senate Appropriations Committee. It's a bit wider gap on the House Appropriations Committee because the Republicans have a wider margin in the full chamber. There are 30 Republicans and 22 Democrats for a total of 52 on the House Appropriations Committee. So each committee is theoretically supposed to pass the bills in succession, the 12 bills in succession, and they're supposed to pass their respective chambers. They then go to the opposite house, and the opposite house has two options basically: approve what was sent them by the other house, or reject it and pass their own appropriations bill, which would go to the opposite house. And if that's rejected, then they take those bills to conference. So you can see with 12 bills, it's a bit of a cumbersome process. The conference committee report must be approved by both chambers, and if that happens, then it goes to the president for his signature or veto. And it's a really compressed time frame, and probably why it never gets done on time anymore. But it needs to be done between April and September, and again, end of September. And again, that's when continuing resolutions can come into play. If they don't get them done and they need more time, they'll just extend the current spending. The House actually has done a better job this year than the Senate of passing their appropriations bills, but my guess is that the current spending levels will be extended for another 6 months when the continuing resolution expires in December, and then probably till the start of the next fiscal year. Here's a little better view of the chart. This is really kind of a review of the process. This talks about the budget process, but the appropriations bills do the same type of procedure. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell, in a very boring nutshell. Again, thank everybody for the opportunity. I look again to give a little more color. That's the Senate chamber on the left, and or it's called the upper house, and the House chamber on the right. So be happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you, Bob. So before we go to questions, I just want to remind everyone to please submit your questions through the chat box or the Q&A box. We also have questions that people submitted through registration that we're going to try and answer. You can see we have a full house here. A bunch of people from CLF are on board to listen in as well. We want to do another poll before we go to questions, and I'm going to start that right now. There we go. And our second poll for the audience is, how often do you contact your representatives or senators about budget issues? We'll give people a few seconds to respond. All right, we're going to go ahead and close it. And it looks like we have a nice split between those of you that do talk to your representatives and senators multiple times a year, and those of you that have never contacted them. And we'll get some insights from Bob about kind of where policy councils and other organizations that have an interest in food systems can interject in this process. So close that out. So I wanted to start kind of with a question just about what's happening right now with our appropriations process. Can you talk to us a little bit about kind of what to expect? I know you mentioned that they're trying to kill healthcare through the appropriations process. Can you just talk to us where we are in it and what's happening? And
sure, I've been watching this stuff for a long time, and it's been really shocking to me to see what's going on. I have been surprised a lot about politics and Congress a lot since last November. So right now, they've got until September 30th to finalize the budget resolution. And they're using that, the reconciliation language in that, to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And they can do that because there's a couple of areas that reconciliation can be used to affect. One of them is changing tax law. And since the tax policy was a big chunk of the Affordable Care Act, that's how they can use that. And so I think because of this uncertainty, and I think the main problem, honestly, has been in the Senate. A lot of the appropriations bills have stalled because there's, the budget process is stalled because, like we said in the presentation, it's supposed to be done by April. And here it is the end of September, and they still haven't approved it. So the House has done, I think, 8 of its 12 appropriations bills. I don't think the Senate has done any. And so I'm sure what will have to happen at the end of this continuing resolution period, which will be until December 15th, it'll be extended again, probably for 6 months. And then it'll be close enough to the election that my guess is it could be extended beyond 2018. So we're kind of in limbo. I think that the good thing about, as it relates to the Farm Bill does not expire until September 30th of next year. So current funding of programs is really not affected that dramatically because it's, again, a 5-year authorization, annual appropriation, but extending the current funding for another year is not a huge detriment for Farm Bill people.
Okay. And kind of keeping in line with that, the audience that we have today is very interested in community food systems, in particular in the nutrition programs. Can you talk a little bit about, with this annual process, what becomes most at risk for these programs and what kind of people should be watching out for as they go through the appropriations process?
Right, that's a very good question. Every time I get a question, well, it's kind of hard to tell. I think that nutrition programs will be okay because, again, they're funded based on a formula that needs to be changed by law. So they're, I think, in pretty good shape under the current Farm Bill and with the extension through the continuing resolution. I am worried about attacks on SNAP and other nutrition programs. It kind of goes back and forth. For a while, people were saying, oh, well, we don't want to separate SNAP out. That was tried last time and didn't work. And that's now coming up again. And I worry a lot about that, because it becomes an easier target. Bob Dole, former Kansas Senator Bob Dole, and George McGovern, former South Dakota Senator, decided that marrying the nutrition programs into the Farm Bill was a very smart thing to do. They're both rural senators, but George McGovern cared very deeply about hunger, and they wanted people to understand that farm programs and nutrition programs should work together. So I'm a little bit worried about SNAP going forward. I don't think in the short term there'll be an appropriations issue with it because, again, it's formula based. There's growing interest in expanding local food programs, the types of things that food policy councils can benefit from. I think last year was the first time they got really the attention they deserved. And Debbie Stabenow, senator from Michigan, is a very strong advocate for funding the value-added processor grants, VPAG, I think is the acronym. She's very interested in increased funding for the beginning and disadvantaged farmer program. There's one thing that a lot of sustainable ag advocates in DC are a bit worried about. That is that she wants to combine them into one agency instead of where they exist now. So there's a little bit of concern, I think, about that, but they're quite popular, and I think that will be an area for growth in appropriations and in the Farm Bill. She also wants to establish an undersecretary in USDA for urban agriculture, which is a very good thing to do, and it's actually gotten pretty strong bipartisan support. although the new Secretary of Ag, Secretary Perdue, is kind of like shuffling things around willy-nilly, which is his discretion. And I think that could be addressed in the Farm Bill too, giving the Secretary not so much latitude to, move one program into another agency, or like rural development, all of a sudden it's not a standalone undersecretary. It becomes part of, his secretary's office. So I think we're in, to steal diplomatic language, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Okay, that's good to hear. Can you talk about just the extension of, funding of USDA programs with this process? How much discretion do the agencies have in the disbursement of funding that gets appropriated for their agencies?
Well, they're not supposed to have an awful lot, but they tend to exercise more than they should. And there's no, now with the Republican Congress and Republican administration, there's probably not going to be much oversight about how that's done. So they're supposed to, I think the language is, dispersing program money as need is proven or something like that. Sometimes if people are hostile to a program, they won't spend the money. And there's not a lot you can do about that.
It's kind of like a waste.
Yeah. Well, and it's really, it can be worse when the executive and the Congress are of a different party. Mm-hmm. But with Trump, you don't know what's going to go on. So, it's kind of a uncertain situation.
Okay. Would you talk about what committees, what appropriations committees are important for the nutrition and food systems programs?
Yeah, well, I think, again, the Ag Appropriations Subcommittee is probably, I would consider the most important. I had a list of the bills that really follow the appropriations bill. So there's a subcommittee in the House and Senate Appropriations Committees for each bill, and I really think that the Ag Subcommittee is the key.
Okay.
The Ag, it's been interesting in the House of Representatives. The Ag Committee has been holding. Not the Ag Approach Subcommittee, but the Ag Committee itself has been holding a lot of hearings on the SNAP program. I think that from an appropriation standpoint, I'd focus on that subcommittee, but also the authorizing committee, the House Ag Committee too. So
talking about the committees, there's been several questions that we got from people when they registered about how do food policy councils get involved? We talk a lot about being involved in the legislative process, and the appropriations process might be one that, some food policy councils are already starting to talk to representatives and senators, but for those that aren't, what's the first step? How do we get involved? Where should we insert ourselves?
Yeah, well, as a general rule, I think inserting yourself as early as possible in the process, the better. And if you happen to have a member of the House or Senate that's on one of the appropriations committees, it's like a jackpot, because they'll be more receptive to your interests than if they're not on the committee. So Karen said that correctly that I'd worked for a member of the Appropriations Committee. I actually worked for the last 4 Democratic senators from South Dakota, and Dan Glickman when he was a member of Congress. And I worked both at the state level and federal levels at different times for different people. And I think a really good place to start is to get to know your in-state staff people from your senator's office or your congressperson's office. They are a feeder network to the legislative staff in Washington. And a lot of times it's much easier to get in to see them than it is to come to DC and meet with the Hill staff. So I would get to know them very well. I would, if you have a program that is a success that you want to protect, make sure that they know about that. Make sure that you take them to that, if it's a feeding site or whatever. Or if you have a strong, aggressive food policy council that meets, have them come to one of your meetings. So you build an ally with the local people because, like I said, well, it depends on offices. Some Hill staff are a bit arrogant and don't want to listen to the state staff. I'd always been an advocate, whether I was at the state level or the Hill level, that the in-state staff are really critical for people in DC to know what's going on. So I would start, developing educational materials for the local members. It's also a bit easier, excuse me, to meet with a senator or a representative when they're in the state. Their schedules aren't quite as jammed, and the whole purpose of them coming home is to meet constituents. So getting to know the state staff, asking them to help you with their corresponding Hill staff person is a good way to go. Directly communicating with the Hill staff when a piece of legislation is coming up that you're interested in can be part of the outcomes of building local relationships.
Great. Do you have any advice for councils that may be embedded in a local government? Is there anything in particular that's different that they could do?
Yeah, I don't think so, although I think that they, because they're embedded in local government, probably have a little bit bigger voice, may get a quicker response than those that aren't. But I think any food policy council can build access to their member. Remember, the people that work in the state are members of the community that you live in and operate in too, and they're more than likely going to want to hear from you.
Do you have any advice for councils that may be a little worried about crossing a line in terms of lobbying?
Yeah, well, we have that same concern here at CLF. We're Johns Hopkins is a 501c3 organization, so we're not supposed to lobby. We have even tighter restrictions because of the nature of the Hopkins system. But I think, so the way we get around it is we prepare educational briefs on issues. And if something comes up that, we want to influence or provide information on, we talk about the benefits of the approach we're promoting and the downsides to the changes that could happen. We never say, oh, vote against this or vote for this. The other thing we do is when we develop educational information, there are advocacy groups that are partners of ours, and we're very fortunate at Hopkins that our name carries quite a bit of weight in certain circles, and so that's the way that a group that is barred by funders or their tax status from lobbying is. You can provide really borderline advocacy pieces based on your program that you give to someone else to use to advocate on your behalf.
Okay, that's great advice. I want to go back to the Farm Bill a little bit and talk about the process. I know you said that there could, right now, the Farm Bill has until 2018, and so there's appropriations that go along with that. We've talked a lot about how councils can engage in the Farm Bill process. Will you talk some about, after that process is done, then engagement in the appropriations process? What do they need to be looking out for the Farm Bill, and how do they continue their advocacy after?
Yeah, well, I think, when a multi-year authorization bill is set, and the real battle then becomes annually, and it's really continuing because, as I said, then really every federal agency, the budget process never stops. And most, and you can tweak, in a 5-year Farm Bill, programs can be tweaked through the appropriations process. So it's really, it's like, again, getting to know, because every member votes on the appropriations bill. Everybody has input. Again, if you have a member, if you live in an area where your member's on the appropriations committee, you have kind of hit the jackpot because you have a direct line into the process. So it's like working any piece of legislation, getting to know, again, the local people, justifying the good work that you're doing. And so there's really no magic difference between appropriations and authorization, except approps is all the time.
Annual. So we got to keep going.
Got to keep going. Never give up.
Never give up. Lastly, are there any resources or information that you would recommend people go to, or sources to find more information about the process, or just to be able to follow it?
Yeah, so there's a couple really good resources. The Library of Congress has a resource called congress.gov that has every bill that's introduced and tracks every bill and every change to every bill. So when it's introduced or when there's any new co-sponsor added, when it moves through the legislative process, you can track that by the bill number. There are a number of agencies that, or non-governmental organizations that track legislative activity and appropriations activities. A pretty good one, they don't do so much on the Farm Bill, but is the Bipartisan Policy Center. There's the Center for Budget and Policy Priority. You know, some groups like the National Sustainable Ag Coalition will track appropriations process and advancement, and are a very good group for really weighing in. They're very well networked on the Hill. If you're, I don't know the background of the groups on the webinar, but if you're part of a larger association, member of a larger association, make sure that your, you know, local needs are being made aware of to your national association.
Who are you following right now?
On
the appropriations process?
Well, so CLF has a particular interest in sustainable agricultural issues, and so we're doing a bit of a two things. We're trying to keep our eye on funding for sustainable programs. We do some on the nutrition funding, but that's actually, you guys do more of that than we do. As far as the new Farm Bill, we're very interested in efforts to try to open up traditional livestock programs to more sustainable producers. Things like the Environmental Quality Improvement Program that's part of the National Conservation Resource Service. That, over the years, about 62% of that's been used for livestock efforts, and that's a bit out of balance. And of that 62%, almost all of it goes to building CAFO lagoons. So what we're trying to do by working with NSAC and others is open that up to provide comparable benefits to pasture-based livestock operations that the CAFOs get. So it's like equip funding, and we've been very strong on conservation programs being part of the required. If you get crop insurance, you have to meet certain conservation program guidelines. It's called cross compliance usually. Carolyn Rico and I were just on a webinar by USDA recently that actually showed by doing that, water erosion in croplands dropped significantly. So, and that's what we, not only not erode land, but conservation practices help provide cleaner water. Right? So those are the kinds of things we've been looking at on the Farm Bill. On approps, it's just, I mean, it's such a circus, it's really hard to follow any one thing.
Just trying to catch it all.
Yeah, I used to, when I worked for Tom Daschle, when he was Democratic leader of the Senate, you could tell when it was the 11th hour and appropriations were kind of bogged down, when a deal was going to be cut, because watching on TV, you'd see Senator Daschle and Senator Lott, who was at one time minority leader when Daschle was majority leader, and they flipped. They'd go to the back of the chamber, kind of turn their backs to the cameras, and all of a sudden you'd see the heads start nodding, and like a slap on one another's backs, and the deal's cut. Get ready for the press. and you would have, so there's this, the whole support network really in offices too, especially members that are on approps. You pay very close attention to every nuance in the appropriations process. And when that last conversation comes and the heads are nodding, you have a pretty good idea what the two options are and probably where they struck a deal. Yeah. So it's really, it's kind of the Wild West now.
I bet it is.
Yeah.
And that's part of the process that for the general public we don't see very often.
Right.
So, we do as much as we can. We'll go and talk to our senators and representatives and see how far it goes. And then
very important for your voice to be heard and to start locally. And then use that local connection, like I said, to get to know the corresponding Hill staffers.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I don't see any more questions. I'll give it one more minute if anyone has any other questions that you want to chat in. But I just thank you so much for coming and sitting with us this afternoon and chatting with us about the budget appropriations process. It's been very helpful and informative.
Oh, good. I never know.
It's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks for asking me. I do appreciate it, and be happy to follow up if anybody has any questions.
Great. We will send out Bob's email address along with the slides and a recording of the presentation, as well as anyone that registered for the webinar, so you can watch it again. If you need definitions, they'll be in the slides. So I don't see any more questions, and with that, I'm going to conclude today's webinar. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.